Welcome, fellow night owl. If you're just settling in for a cozy, relaxing listen, perhaps nestled beneath the covers or sinking into a comfy armchair, I'm so glad you've joined us. Before we embark on tonight's journey through the fascinating and often grim world of piracy, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. Perhaps it's a rainy evening in London, a sunny afternoon in Sydney, or the wee hours of the morning in New York. Wherever and whenever you are, I'm delighted to have you along for the voyage. If you enjoy calm, immersive storytelling that brings history to life in rich detail, all while helping you unwind and drift off to sleep, you might consider subscribing to this channel. We'll be exploring all sorts of intriguing corners of history in this soft, relaxing style. And tonight, we turn our attention to the golden age of piracy. When you picture a pirate, what images spring to mind? Perhaps a fearsome figure with a patch over one eye, a cutlass in hand, and a colourful parrot perched on his shoulder. You might envision a band of swashbuckling rogues hoisting the Jolly Roger as they set out in search of plunder and adventure across the sun-dappled Caribbean. This is the pirate of storybooks and Hollywood films, a romantic anti-hero who's as charming as he is dangerous. But as is so often the case, the reality was quite a bit grimmer and more complicated than the legends suggest. While the exploits of famous pirates like Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts have been burnished by myth into tales of daring do, the true story of life as a pirate during the Golden Age was one of hardship, brutality, ever-present danger, and often grim fates. Tonight, we'll peer behind the curtain of pirate lore to uncover what that life was really like for the men, and even a few women, who sailed under the black flag. As you get settled in, let your mind begin to paint a vivid picture of the world we'll be exploring. The year is 1716, and the golden age of piracy is at its peak. Across the Caribbean, the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean, pirate ships prowl the waves, scouring the horizon for their next prize. But even as their fearsome reputation strikes terror into merchant crews and passengers alike, the reality for those aboard the pirate vessels is far from the promise of riches and glory. Let's begin our tale with a young sailor named James. James is 19 years old, the son of a struggling English farmer. Desperate to escape poverty and lured by the promise of adventure, he signed on with a merchant ship bound for the West Indies. But life aboard the merchant vessel was almost as grim as the hardscrabble existence he'd left behind. The work was ceaseless and backbreaking, the rations meagre and often rotten. The ship's captain was a tyrant, doling out beatings for the smallest infractions. James found himself crammed into dark, filthy quarters with dozens of other miserable souls, constantly damp from the seawater that sloshed beneath the decks, and sick from the stench of unwashed bodies and bilge water. It was a brutal existence, but at least it offered the faint promise of wages and a chance at a new life in the colonies. That is, until James's ship was intercepted by a Royal Navy frigate short on crew. Invoking the hated practice of impressment, the Navy captain forced James and a dozen of his crewmates into service against their will. Now James found himself trapped in an even grimmer situation, forced to labour on a warship for pitiful wages and subject to even harsher discipline and dangers. He watched his fellow sailors succumb to scurvy, dysentery and the lash, all while facing the constant perils of battle and storm. After months of this misery, half-starved and driven to the brink, James and a handful of his desperate comrades saw their chance. Their ship had just taken a fat Spanish prize laden with treasure, and the captain had let discipline slack for a few precious hours of celebration. In the dark of night, James and his fellow mutineers slipped into the captain's cabin. A few moments of silent, bloody work later, they had control of the ship. And just like that, they ceased to be miserable Navy conscripts and became something else entirely: pirates. As you begin to drift off, let your imagination linger on this moment. James standing on the blood-slicked deck of his newly captured ship, a crisp Caribbean breeze whipping at his hair, as he and his fellow pirates hoist the Jolly Roger for the first time. The grim realities of the pirate life are still ahead of him. The long stretches of boredom and squalor, the ever-present threat of the noose. But for that one moment, with the promise of freedom and plunder ahead, perhaps you can understand the allure that drew so many desperate men to the Black Flag. We'll leave James there for now, as you settle deeper into relaxation, ready to explore more of his world. In our next chapter, we'll delve into the harsh realities of life aboard a pirate ship, the predatory economics, the brutal discipline, the ever-present spectre of disease and starvation. I hope you'll join me as the story unfolds. Until then, I wish you fair winds and sweet dreams. As the sun sank low over the glistening Caribbean, the notorious pirate Edward Teach, better known by his fearsome moniker Blackbeard, stood at the bow of his ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge. The vessel's sails billowed in the warm evening breeze, propelling him and his crew of hardened brigands toward their next daring raid. Blackbeard cut an imposing figure against the fiery sky, his thick dark beard braided with ribbons and his towering frame draped in a swirling coat. But beneath this iconic image lay a far less romantic reality. The harsh, brutal, and often short existence of a sailor turned to piracy in the early 18th century. Born Edward Teach in Bristol, England, around 1680, the future scourge of the seas first tasted naval life as a young privateer in Queen Anne's War. Privateering, a form of legal piracy sponsored by governments to harass enemy ships, introduced Teach to the thrilling pursuit and capture of vessels on the high seas. But when the war ended in 1713, Teach and countless other mariners found themselves adrift without employment. For many, piracy beckoned as their only escape from destitution. Teach joined the crew of the pirate Benjamin Hornigold, learning the outlaws' tactics of intimidation and guerrilla warfare in the West Indies and off the American coast. In an era of great economic upheaval and inequality, piracy surged as desperate men sought to seize by force the riches that society denied them. Monarchy and aristocracy accumulated vast wealth, while common sailors earned meagre wages and endured brutal discipline in the royal navies and merchant fleets. Naval life in the 18th century was a hard and joyless existence. Rations were poor, living quarters cramped and unsanitary, disease rampant, and punishment severe. Sailors were often impressed into service against their will, seized by press gangs, and forced to leave their homes and families for years at sea. Faced with such intolerable conditions, many sailors jumped ship and turned pirate when the opportunity arose. Teach seized command of his own pirate ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, and earned his fearsome reputation as Blackbeard along the American coast and Caribbean. His name would become legend, evoking both admiration and terror. Yet his actual life as a pirate was nasty, brutish, and ultimately short. The reality aboard pirate ships was far grimmer than in most romantic imaginings. Conditions were crowded, filthy, and filled with the constant threats of violence, disease, and malnutrition. Pirates imposed strict discipline on their crews, with harsh punishments like flogging and marooning for any who broke the code. On long voyages far from land, the dreaded spectre of scurvy haunted every pirate. This wasting disease, caused by vitamin C deficiency, made gums bleed, teeth fall out, and old wounds reopen as it ravaged a sufferer's body. Other common scourges included dysentery, typhus, malaria, and yellow fever, which could rip through a ship and decimate its crew. The combat tactics of pirates depended more on speed and intimidation than firepower. They aimed to rapidly overtake and board victim ships, then cow them into submission by a show of force. Blackbeard honed this psychological warfare to a fine art, cultivating his diabolical appearance and demeanor to strike terror into his targets' hearts. When intimidation failed, combat was vicious, bloody, and often hand-to-hand. Pirates were hardened fighters and notoriously reckless, even suicidal in battle. Many wore an eye patch not from some heroic combat injury, but simply because it kept one eye adjusted to the darkness below decks, where the fiercest close-quarters fighting occurred. For all the perils they braved, most pirates saw paltry rewards. The loot from merchant ships was quickly spent or gambled away in port, with little saved or invested. Despite legends of vast buried treasure, most pirates remained poor, chasing an elusive dream of riches that always seemed just over the horizon. Among the pirate ranks of the Golden Age were two women, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who defied the era's rigid gender roles. Both originally disguised themselves as men to join pirate crews, but their true identities were eventually discovered. By all accounts, they were the equals of any male pirates in ferocity and fighting skill. Irish-born Anne Bonny was drawn into piracy by her lover, Calico Jack Rackham. She earned a fearsome reputation for her ferocity in battle, reputedly fighting on even as Rackham and the rest of his crew cowered drunk below decks. When their ship was captured by British pirate hunters, Bonny was sentenced to hang, but she won a stay of execution by claiming to be pregnant. Her ultimate fate is unknown. Mary Read had a similar tale, taking to male disguise as a youth to join the British military, then later turning to piracy in the Caribbean. She linked up with Bonny and Rackham aboard the pirate ship Revenge. In the last battle of their pirate careers, Red and Bonny were the only ones to offer any serious resistance as pirate hunters seized their ship. Red, too, avoided the noose by pregnancy, but tragically succumbed to a fever in her Jamaican prison cell. As British authorities vowed to suppress the pirate scourge, skilled pirate hunters like Woodes Rogers and Benjamin Hornigold ruthlessly pursued the most notorious brigands. Once pirate comrades themselves, Hornigold and Rogers had accepted royal pardons and now relentlessly stalked their former brethren. It was pirate hunter Robert Maynard who finally killed Blackbeard after a ferocious battle off the coast of North Carolina in 1718. According to legend, Blackbeard suffered 5 gunshot wounds and 20 cutlass slashes before finally succumbing with his boots on. Maynard hung the beheaded corpse from his ship's bowsprit as a grim warning to other pirates, and the infamous Blackbeard passed into the realm of myth. Most pirates met similarly brutal ends. For the few who survived long enough to see trial, the inevitable sentence was death. They were hanged high from dockside gallows in public spectacles of violence intended to deter potential pirates. In a final act of defiance, some went to their deaths without repentance, mocking the authorities and encouraging comrades to the end. The pirate Charles Vane reportedly commented from the scaffold, "I hope there are some pirates here today. I was one myself and lived that life for over 20 years. And if there be any here, my advice to you is to make your hay while the sun shines. For I don't grudge the hangman his wages, nor the government their due. There is an entire world filled with wealth, and you have only to take it in your own 2 hands. Good luck, boys, and farewell." As naval power projection improved, and the great colonial empires consolidated control over maritime trade routes, the golden age of piracy flickered and died away. By the 1730s, changing economic conditions had made piracy a less viable alternative to legal seamanship, and the remaining freebooters struggled to survive, let alone prosper. In the centuries since, the brief reign of the pirates has been romanticized and mythologized in endless books and films. The real pirates, those desperate men driven to crime and insurrection against a harsh world order, have largely been forgotten, their sufferings and sacrifices obscured behind a veil of dashing legends. The true face of piracy was a life of brutality, privation, and grim fatalism in the struggle to survive. Pirates embraced lives of crime and violence not as romantic heroes, but as outcasts and renegades. They raged against their civilization's hypocrisies and iniquities, but their resistance was ultimately futile and self-destructive. So as you drift off tonight, spare a thought for Blackbeard, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, Charles Vane, and the faceless thousands of others who lived and died as pirates. Remember them not as the caricatures of popular culture, but as they truly were. Defiant and doomed rebels clinging to the margins of a cruel world. The last glimmering of that lost age fades into the gathering dusk as sleep's tides carry you to morning's shores. 11. The pirate's legacy. As the golden age of piracy faded into history, the real pirates who terrorized the seas would soon be eclipsed by the myth of the pirate that began to take hold in the popular imagination. In the centuries that followed, the brutal realities of pirate life, the hardship, the violence, the ever-present spectre of death, gradually gave way to an oddly romanticized image. In books, plays, and later films, the pirate transformed from a desperate criminal leading a short, brutal life into a jaunty, adventurous rogue. The tattered, filthy clothes became flamboyant costumes. The pirate's grim struggle for survival in a hostile world became a dashing quest for glittering treasure. Real pirates who were stricken with scurvy were reimagined swigging from bottles of rum. The dangerous, often deadly pirate life was recast as one of freedom and adventure, a glamorous alternative to the restrictions of civilized society. The likes of Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Charles Vane became folk heroes and icons, their grisly ends forgotten or glossed over. Even pirates who were nothing more than vicious killers, like Edward Lowe, were celebrated as rebellious anti-heroes. This myth of the romantic pirate so captured the public's imagination that it has endured for centuries. But one wonders what the real pirates of the Golden Age would have made of this strange second life granted to them by posterity. These hardened men, and a few women, who risked everything for an uncertain share of plunder, who endured unimaginable hardships, and who usually met early and violent deaths, might have scoffed at or even resented how their lives have been so thoroughly distorted. For in the sanitized, romanticized depiction of pirates that has taken hold in popular culture, we have lost sight of the stark realities of their existence. We've forgotten the rampant disease, the constant threat of death in battle or by execution, the gnawing hunger and thirst, the long stretches of boredom punctuated by terror, the hard choices driven by economic desperation. The real lives of pirates were not the stuff of adventure yarns and theme park rides. They were brutal and short, full of suffering and cruelty. Perhaps, if those long-dead pirates could speak to us now, they might tell us to remember them as they truly were. Not dashing anti-heroes, but desperate men driven to extremes. Not romantic rogues, but struggling souls doing what they thought they must to survive in a harsh and unforgiving world. They might warn us not to envy their illusory freedom, bought at the price of hardship, violence, and an early grave. And yet, the romanticized image of the pirate has proven indelible. The grim truths, no match for the allure of the tall tales. The myth has taken on a life of its own, one quite apart from the difficult realities of actual pirate life. And so the pirates of the Golden Age will likely go on living their strange second lives as dashing adventurers, even as the real stories of their hard, brutal, all too short existences continue to fade, buried like forgotten treasure beneath the more appealing legend. 12th conclusion. And so, as we've journeyed through the history of the Golden Age of piracy, we've seen that the grim realities of pirate life were a far cry from the romantic myths that have sprung up in the centuries since. For most of the men, and occasional women, who turned to piracy in the early 18th century, it was not a life of adventure and easy riches, but one of hardship, brutality, and usually an early death. From the desperate economic straits and harsh naval conditions that drove many to become pirates in the first place, to the constant threats of bloody battle, execution, and debilitating disease they faced in their brief careers, the lot of a pirate was not an enviable one. The freedom they sought came at the cost of a hard and precarious existence, the camaraderie of shipboard life balanced by the ever-present risk of betrayal or marooning. The lure of plunder was tempered by the often paltry and quickly squandered rewards for their risky endeavours. Most pirates never achieved the lasting fame of a Blackbeard or Bartholomew Roberts, their names and deeds lost to history. Many met their ends on the gallows, their bodies displayed as a grim warning to others who might be tempted to the pirating life. Still more succumbed to the scourges of injury, disease, and malnutrition that were rampant in the squalid conditions aboard pirate vessels. Vanishingly few lived to see old age or enjoy their ill-gotten gains. Yet despite these hard truths, the myth of the pirate as a dashing rogue, a rebellious anti-hero, has proven enduringly appealing. In the centuries since the Golden Age, the grim realities have been gradually obscured by the more romantic legend. The pirate of fiction and film is a jaunty adventurer, not a desperate criminal. His life is one of freedom and excitement, not hardship and brutality. Perhaps this romanticized image has endured because in our modern lives of comfort and security, we find something alluring about the idea of the pirate as a bold rebel, defying the strictures of society for a life of adventure. Or maybe the grim realities of pirate life are simply too uncomfortable, too at odds with what we want to believe, and so we choose to embrace the myth instead. But as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for the real pirates of the Golden Age, not the romanticized figures of legend, but the flesh and blood men and women who struggled and suffered, who risked all for uncertain rewards in a harsh and unforgiving world. Let us remember them as they truly were, in all their flawed and desperate humanity. And in doing so, perhaps we can separate the pirate of myth from the pirate of history, recognizing both the allure of the legend and the grim realities that lie beneath it. For in understanding the true stories of these long-ago outlaws, we may gain a new appreciation for the often difficult choices and harsh realities faced by those who lived on the margins of society, whether in the 18th century or today. And with that thought, let us bid good night to the ghosts of the golden age of piracy, letting their stories, both the grim realities and the enduring myths, follow us into our dreams. As the ship's cook laboriously worked to prepare the crew's meals, the threat of food poisoning was a constant spectre looming over pirate life. With limited means of preserving meats and produce, spoilage was an ever-present danger. Tainted rations could quickly sicken the entire crew, leaving them vulnerable to disease and unable to man the ship effectively. The cook had to make do with whatever provisions were on hand, often turning old scraps and questionable ingredients into barely palatable slop. Weevil-infested hardtack, rancid salted pork and stale biscuits were typical fare. Scurvy-preventing rations like sauerkraut and lemons were prize commodities, jealously guarded and rationed. Fresh water was equally precious and precarious aboard a pirate ship. Casks of drinking water could easily be tainted by algae, insects, or worse. Crews lived in constant fear of the water running out during long sea voyages. Stagnant, contaminated water bred dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases that could ravage a ship. Malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies were rampant among pirate crews living on such monotonous and often spoiled rations for months at sea. Scurvy was by far the most feared and deadly of these scourges. This wasting disease, caused by lack of vitamin C, led to swollen, bleeding gums, loss of teeth, fatigue, and reopening of old wounds. In its advanced stages, scurvy was a slow, gruesome death sentence. In the early 1700s, a pirate named John Easton recorded a particularly harrowing encounter with this dread affliction. Easton's crew was 3 months into a voyage across the Atlantic. with supplies of fruit and vegetables long since exhausted. The men were subsisting on little more than wormy grain, stale bread, and grog. Scurvy began to take hold, slowly crippling the crew. Easton describes one pirate, a seasoned buccaneer named Tom, deteriorating before his eyes. Once a robust, swaggering man, Tom grew listless and withdrawn as scurvy sapped his strength. His gums turned black and rotten, with teeth falling out at an alarming rate. Foul-smelling sores opened on his skin, oozing blood and pus. Towards the end, Tom's joints seized up, leaving him immobile and raving with pain and fever. Most of Easton's crew succumbed to scurvy on that voyage, their bodies committed to the deep. It was a fate that struck fear into the heart of every pirate. Hendrik van der Decken, a Dutch merchant sailor who turned to piracy, likened an outbreak of scurvy on board to a living death, with worm-ridden skeletons begging for the release of the grave. Such was the spectre of disease and malnourishment that constantly stalked pirates on the high seas. Even when pirates were well fed and free of scurvy and dysentery, they faced the risk of debilitating tropical illnesses. Voyages to the Caribbean and the coasts of Africa exposed them to yellow fever, malaria, and other endemic diseases for which they had no immunity or remedy. These illnesses could scythe through a ship's company like a hot knife through butter. In 1721, the crew of pirate captain Bartholomew Roberts raided shipping along the Guinea coast, also known as the White Man's Grave, for its fearsome disease environment. Within 2 months, more than half of Roberts's crew had succumbed to the bloody flux and malignant fever. John Atkins, a British Navy surgeon, examined the emaciated survivors. He described men raving with a pestilential delirium, with yellow visages and skin pricked by hemorrhages. Outbreaks of yellow fever, malaria, and other tropical diseases devastated pirate crews, leaving survivors too weak to even crew their ships. The pirate Woodes Rogers, who later turned pirate hunter, lost so many men to yellow fever while raiding the Brazilian coast that he had to temporarily abandon 2 of his prizes for lack of crew. Such was the ever-present scourge of disease inherent in the pirate life. Beyond the inescapable threats of malnutrition and illness, a pirate also had to contend with the constant danger of grievous injury in battle and shipboard life. Puncture wounds, gashes, lacerations, and blunt force trauma were par for the course in the heat of a naval engagement or a pirate boarding action. Even routine work aboard a ship carried serious risk in an era without safety precautions. Falls from the rigging, crush injuries from heavy equipment, and lacerations from frayed ropes and splintered wood were commonplace. A pirate who lost a finger, toe, or eye to such everyday hazards had little choice but to bind up the wound and soldier on. There was no respite for the injured or maimed in the pitiless world of piracy. Serious wounds and injuries often meant a slow, agonizing death sentence in the age of sail. With little understanding of infection or sterile practices, even minor wounds could quickly fester and turn gangrenous in the fetid, cramped, unsanitary conditions aboard a ship. Cauterization with boiling tar was a common field expedient to stem bleeding, with agonizing results. Accounts of pirate surgeons using carpenter's saws to crudely amputate mangled limbs and digits, without anesthesia or proper surgical tools, paint a grisly picture of the realities of medical treatment at sea. Men lucky enough to survive such brutal ministrations often did not live long, soon being carried off by sepsis and secondary infections. The infamous pirate Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, bore numerous scars from such grievous wounds. His body was crisscrossed with the marks of blades, bullets, and even a pistol burst that blew off several of his fingers. Teach was said to keep the severed digits in a pouch, morbidly showing them off while drinking and carousing. For Blackbeard and his ilk, disfiguring wounds were the price of the pirate's life. But beyond the perils of combat, even the everyday labour of manning a ship was fraught with the risk of disabling or fatal injury. Raising anchors, trimming sails, and hauling lines required long hours of back-breaking, dangerous work, often in harsh weather and high seas. Sailors lost fingers to pinching ropes, broke bones in falls, and were crushed by swinging booms and yards. The constant strains, impacts, and abrasions of shipboard life often led to painful chronic conditions like arthritis, bursitis, and repetitive strain injuries. A pirate's hands were often gnarled claws, with missing digits and joints swollen and distended from a lifetime of hard labour and injury. Even if a buccaneer survived battle unscathed, the long-term toll on his body was inescapable. Blackbeard's quartermaster, a man known only as Israel Hands, embodied the ravages of a pirate's life. Hands had been with Teach since the early days, bearing wounds from numerous engagements. He was said to be missing an eye and several fingers, with a face latticed by dueling scars. More ghastly still, Hands' back and joints were twisted and contorted from grueling decades of shipboard labour. Israel Hands was still feared for his ferocity in battle, despite his disfigurements and infirmities. He was Blackbeard's strong right arm, running his ship with an iron hand. But for all his fearsome reputation, it was a life of unrelenting pain and physical torment that Hands and his fellow pirates endured. Their wounds and scars told the grim, unvarnished tale of the pirate's lot. Pirate ships were dark, dank, and claustrophobic, permeated by a miasma of unwashed bodies, rancid bilge water, and the ever-present stench of decay. Vermin like rats, fleas, and lice were inescapable, spreading pestilence and misery. Pirates scratched at weeping sores and pus-filled buboes, even as they fought desperate, blood-soaked battles and drank themselves into stupor to forget their pain. The hell of a long sea voyage was compounded by the constant spectre of violent death or maiming that hung over every pirate. A life of endless toil, privation, and squalor was more often than not cut short by a bloody end in battle, on the gallows, or racked by agonizing disease. This was the grim reality concealed behind the romantic myths of piracy. Few accounts capture this awful truth more starkly than the last moments of the notorious pirate William Fly. Gibbeted in Boston Harbor in 1726 for leading a mutiny and turning to piracy, Fly presented a ghastly spectacle. Emaciated by jail fever and with his body burdened with sores and scars, he seemed a walking corpse even before the hangman's noose snapped his neck. Yet Fly remained defiant to the end, refusing to repent for his crimes and calling out the injustices and abuses that drove starving men to piracy. His hollow eyes and wasted frame seemed almost a personification of the miseries and hardships of the pirate's life. A witness recalled Fly's lifeless, pox-ridden countenance as emblematic of the depravities and misfortunes to which they subject themselves who go a-pirating. William Fly's grisly fate and the awful condition of his broken body stand as a stark warning of the realities of pirate life beneath the romanticized facade. The true face of piracy was not the dashing swashbuckler or the merry rogue of legend, but a man like Fly, disease-ravaged, maimed by violence, driven to desperation and destruction by the hardships and cruelties of his lot. As we peer through the veil of piratical mythology, we glimpse the grim truth beneath, a life of squalor, hunger, disease, and ever-present danger, where even the bonds of loyalty and brotherhood among buccaneers were all too often poisoned by suspicion, betrayal, and murderous violence. The lot of the pirate was a brutal and usually brief one, with few escaping a bloody end. Such was the cold reality of life under the Jolly Roger. The pirate's plunder, the lure of untold riches, golden doubloons, glittering jewels, majestic treasure chests overflowing with booty. These are the romantic images that have long captured our imaginations when we think of pirates. But the reality, I'm afraid, was usually far less glamorous or rewarding for the sea robbers of the Golden Age. Contrary to the fanciful buried treasure of storybooks, the average pirate's plunder was often meager, unpredictable, and far from secure. While Hollywood films depict pirates as living like kings off vast piles of gold, most struggled through long stretches of empty pockets and growling stomachs between scores. And those sporadic prizes they did manage to seize were usually quickly frittered away on rum and revelry at the next port, rather than saved or buried. You see, the pirate's life was one of constant desperation. Incessantly hunted by navy ships and with few friendly ports for refuge, they lived in perpetual danger and uncertainty. The only real security lay in their hidden island bases and the solidarity of their pirate brethren, and both demanded ample shares of whatever treasures were taken to maintain. Most plunder was thus quickly divided up, hurriedly spent in debauched sprees ashore, gambled away or traded for needed food, repairs and armaments before the long, hard months at sea began again. Buried treasure was scarce for practical reasons as well. Coins and jewels were easily divided, pocketed, and spent or traded, rather than lugged around in heavy chests. Any cumbersome treasures like artwork or opulent clothing seized from ships would be fenced at the first opportunity. Why bury your valuables in remote islands when a pirate's life was so perilous and uncertain? Most buccaneers wanted their gold jangling in their pockets, not gathering dust in the ground. Of course, there were certainly scattered cases of pirates seizing memorable large treasure scores, like the famed exploits of Captain Kidd or Blackbeard. But these were very much the exceptions in the pirating life, not the norms. The promise of that one big haul was a fickle siren call that led many a hopeful pirate to a watery grave, empty-handed. For most pirates, the plunder was merely a temporary reprieve from hardship and want, not a key to enduring riches. A successful raid might yield a few weeks or months of rum-soaked hedonism and the ability to replace tattered clothes or repair beaten ships. But the gold was always quick to drain away, leaving the buccaneer facing the same hard choices and brutal realities that drove him to piracy in the first place. It was a vicious, uncertain cycle with scant hope of escape. There's a true story that poignantly illustrates the fleeting nature of pirate treasure. In 1720, the pirate captain Christopher Condent captured an Arabian ship laden with gold, silver, jewels, and other precious cargo, a haul valued at over £150,000, one of the largest pirate scores ever. But just 3 years later, Condent had lost it all, every coin squandered on wine, women, and gambling. The once swaggering pirate king died a broken-down alcoholic, begging for drinks in the taverns of Saint-Domingue. For all the risks they took and blood they spilled, very few pirates ever found more than ephemeral tastes of treasure, let alone the enduring myth of glory and riches. The hard, cruel mathematics of the pirating life ensured most who embarked upon it would wind up in unmarked graves with little more than the clothes on their backs and the lead in their bellies to show for it. Far more dependable were the meager, unglamorous rewards the pirate could usually count on after a raid. A few coins in his purse, a hammock to sleep in, and a belly periodically filled with food and rum. Not quite the mountains of glittering gold doubloons the storybooks would have us imagine. But then, so little about real pirates' short, brutal lives aligned with the romantic myths that would loftily paint them in following centuries. Perhaps the cruelest twist of the pirates' plunder was that the ultimate rewards were so often reserved for those who had done the least to earn them. Pirate captains, far from the daring swordsmen leading every charge in movies, often lurked in the rear to preserve their lives and command. Yet they were entitled to double the shares of an ordinary crewman who risked life and limb on the front lines of every raid. As with so much in their world, The promise of riches was a beguiling facade, concealing the far grimmer inequities of a pirate's reality. Still, the feverish draw of treasure was undeniably one of the foremost lures into the pirating life for many desperate sailors and adventurers. Spellbound by rumors of gold-laden galleons and glittering pirate hordes, they let the dream of a quick fortune blind them to the deadly realities that would likely greet them. Even if the average buccaneer never saw a fraction of the riches he imagined, the intoxicating thought that the next prize over the horizon just might change his fortunes forever was a powerful opiate indeed. As you drift off tonight, let those romantic images of pirates' gold and jewels dance in your head a while, the dazzling baubles and chests spilling over with glittering plunder. Just remember that for the real pirates of the Golden Age, those visions were but wisps of fantasy glimpsed between long bouts of hardship, tedium, and brutality as their short, hard lives wore away on the sea. The treasure was always just one more illusory figment of the enduring pirate myth, flitting like a tantalizing mirage over far grimmer realities. So while buried treasure makes for delightful storybook fare, I'm afraid the average seagoing pirate found little more than pockets of desperation and a few doubloons to dull his miseries in his short, uncertain life upon the waves. Reality, as is so often the case, tended to be far less kind or romantic than the gilded legends we so love to spin. As the sun sank slowly beneath the waves, the pirate ship bobbed gently on the darkening sea. The crew had finished another long day of backbreaking labour, hoisting sails, scrubbing decks, and manning the bilge pumps to keep the leaky vessel afloat. As dusk fell, the lucky ones not on night watch descended wearily into the cramped, reeking darkness of the gun deck to grab a few precious hours of sleep in swaying hammocks. There was no privacy aboard a pirate ship. The crew lived crushed together like rats in a barrel. The gun deck was a long, narrow space, just 5 feet high, running the length of the ship. Dozens of unwashed, hard-bitten men slung their hammocks wherever they could find room amidst the hulking shapes of cannons. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, tar, tobacco smoke, and the sickly sweet reek of rock-gut rum. There was barely room to sit up in your hammock without your head brushing the begrimed beams above. Here the pirates were packed cheek by jowl, with no escape from the coughs, curses, and drunken mutterings of their fellows. Sleep came uneasily, if at all, as the ship creaked and groaned, rolling in the unceasing swell of the sea. Rats scurried in the shadows, scavenging for crumbs. Clouds of fleas and lice tormented the sleepers, leaving them poxed with itching bites that became festering sores in the humid filth. It was a relief to escape the fetid, suffocating warren of the gun deck, even for a shift of exhausting labour in the salt spray and scorching sun above. Such was the lot of the common seaman aboard a pirate ship in the early 18th century, the twilight years of the golden age of piracy. It was a hard, joyless existence, a life of grinding toil, wretched deprivation, and constant peril, miles removed from the fanciful romance of adventure novels and Hollywood films. Most who turned pirate were refugees from even worse abuse and exploitation aboard naval and merchant vessels. The golden promise of piracy, a life of freedom, plenty, and easy riches, was rarely more than a cruel mirage. The pirate's life was typically nasty, brutish, and short. If the ever-present spectres of violent death in battle and shipboard accident could be avoided, a host of grim afflictions still awaited most buccaneers. Scurvy, typhus, dysentery, malaria, and yellow fever raged through ships whose cramped and unsanitary conditions were almost perfectly designed for incubating and spreading disease. Even a small cut could quickly fester into a fatal infection in the squalid conditions. The inevitable toll of illness and injury was magnified by poor diet and sanitation. Pirates subsisted on biscuits infested with maggots and weevils, on rancid salted meat and foul brackish water. Chronic dehydration in the searing heat added to their miseries, as did the ever-present lash of the ship's disciplinarians. A harsh code of conduct prevailed, and rule breakers, even over petty infractions, could expect swift and merciless punishment, from keel hauling and marooning to flogging and mutilation. It was a life almost unimaginably removed from the fantasies of swashbuckling adventure that have long captured the popular imagination. In 1724, the British author Captain Charles Johnson, a pseudonym most likely for the writer Daniel Defoe, published a sensational bestseller that would do much to mythologize the lives and exploits of pirates. His general history of the pirates was a vivid, fictionalized anthology, chronicling the careers of the era's most notorious buccaneers, from Blackbeard to Bartholomew Roberts to the woman pirate Anne Bonny. Though Johnson had plainly embellished many of the tales for dramatic effect, his rollicking yarns of duels and chases, of fabulous buried treasure and pirate utopias, fired readers' imaginations. His book ignited a craze for pirate lore that has never really faded, as generation after generation has thrilled to romanticize depictions of pirate life. But the reality for the vast majority of pirates was one of constant danger, hardship, and squalor, devoid of riches or glory. Most who turned pirate came to their decision less from dreams of golden plunder and glorious liberty than out of sheer desperation to escape even grimmer circumstances. Throughout the age of sail, conditions for ordinary seamen in all seafaring trades, both naval and merchant, were some of the harshest and most exploitative of any profession. Sailors, especially in the British Royal Navy, endured lives of incredible hardship, privation, and abuse that could make the meagre rations and iron discipline aboard a pirate ship seem almost idyllic by contrast. The lot of the common sailor in this era was dismal by almost any measure. Seamen on merchant and especially naval vessels could expect endless strenuous labour for scant pay in squalid, oppressive, and frequently life-threatening conditions. Rations were scanty and often rotten, living quarters dank and overcrowded, discipline severe to the point of vicious cruelty. Naval wages for ordinary seamen were meagre and frequently in arrears. With inflation, a sailor in 1726 could expect half the weekly pay, in real terms, of his predecessor a century earlier. Long voyages kept men away from home for years and effectively precluded normal family and social lives. But worst of all was the drastic curtailment of personal liberty. Naval seamen in particular were little better than slaves. The moment they set foot on a king's ship, they were subject to a brutal regimen of forced labour and savage corporal punishment under the lash or cat-o'-nine-tails. Even more egregious was the common practice of impressment, whereby working men with seafaring experience were kidnapped by press gangs and forced into naval service against their will. By effectively legalizing this form of shanghaiing from 1664, the British Crown ensured itself a steady supply of experienced seamen to man its imperial fleets, at great savings to the public purse. For most pressed men, naval service meant a life of backbreaking drudgery, constant and often sadistic discipline, disease, disfigurement, danger, and not infrequently death in combat. Scant reward for their forced sacrifice. It meant interminable voyages to foreign climes, far from the comforts of home and family. It meant never knowing if they would see their native shores or loved ones ever again. It meant abandoning any hope of living as free men, making their own choices and charting their own destinies. Perhaps unsurprisingly, desertion from Royal Navy ships was rampant. By some estimates, a sixth of British seamen deserted annually in the early 18th century. Untold numbers of pressed men, given the chance, voted with their feet and escaped their intolerable conditions by fleeing naval service for the promise of life as freebooters. Though still grim and perilous, the pirate life at least offered an escape from the relentless oppression and exploitation of the Royal Navy. Compared to the king's ships they left behind, pirate vessels were downright egalitarian in their power structures and allocation of plunder. Buccaneers elected their captains and drew up written charters codifying the rights and shares of every member of the crew. Pirate ships still required strict discipline to function, but corporal punishment was limited, and a man had at least some say in his fate. The work was still dangerous and backbreaking, but seamen kept a fair portion of any loot and had some chance at prize money. Most of all, a kind of freedom and rough democracy prevailed amongst pirate crews that was found nowhere else in the rigidly hierarchical and authoritarian world of the 18th century, on land or at sea. Every buccaneer had a voice and a vote in shipboard affairs. Officers were elected and could be deposed for dereliction or abuse of power. Plunder was allocated by strict shares, with crew receiving the lion's portion. Manufacturers were punished. The unskilled could rise through ability and, most shockingly, even a small number of blacks found respect and brotherhood as equals. Pirates effectively formed floating proto-democracies with a degree of meritocracy, egalitarianism, and self-determination unparalleled elsewhere in the Atlantic world. At a time of nascent Enlightenment ideas about equality and natural rights, when most ordinary labourers and seamen still toiled in conditions little better than feudal servitude, life aboard a pirate vessel offered a heady taste of liberty and autonomy that was otherwise unimaginable for men of their station. It's little wonder, then, that the choice between naval impressment and piracy was scarcely a choice at all for many seamen. A young sailor kidnapped from the docks of Bristol or Liverpool by a Royal Navy press gang faced a grim future of abusive subjugation, backbreaking drudgery, and quite likely early death in combat or from disease. Offered a chance to jump ship and throw in his lot with freebooters instead, he could hardly be blamed for risking the hangman's noose to live out his days in defiant independence. And so the early 18th century saw the great age of the pirates reach its bloody zenith, as more and more desperate sailors turned buccaneer and the Royal Navy lost ever greater numbers of skilled seamen to the lure of the black flag. The pirate's life was still one of constant mortal peril and frequent brutality, but it was one he had at least chosen freely, beholden to no master but himself, in fellowship with brother outlaws who had likewise seized their own fates. Take the young Edward Cobham, an able seaman pressed into service aboard the HMS Bellona in 1716. Cobham suffered 2 hellish years of abuse, deprivation and drudgery before finally fleeing to join the crew of the notorious pirate captain Howell Davis. Though still hard and precarious, his life as a buccaneer offered a kind of deliverance, a chance at dignity, agency, and self-determination that naval service had stolen from him. For a time, fortune seemed to smile on Cobham and his fellow freebooters as they plundered the lucrative shipping lanes of the Spanish Main. But the pirates' lot was ever a chancy one, and after 2 years of raids and chases, a chance encounter with a Royal Navy frigate near the Bahamas brought their brigand's idyll to a calamitous end. Outgunned and overmatched, Davis and most of his crew were cut down in a bloody rout. Cobham survived the carnage, but his fate was grimmer still. Dragged to Port Royal in chains, the young buccaneer faced the stern justice of the Admiralty Court. Remorse and repentance gained him no reprieve. As a naval deserter turned pirate, he could expect precious little mercy. The morning of November 16th, 1720 found him in manacles atop a crude gallows at Gallows Point before a bloodthirsty crowd, noose knotted about his neck. As the jeers of the mob rang in his ears, Cobham's last thoughts were likely of his agonizing betrayal at the hands of the Royal Navy, and the brief, shining promise of the freedom he had seized in defiance of his impressed servitude. And then, the trapdoor dropped, and an awful snapping of bone signalled that, like so many of his freebooter brethren, Cobham's dance upon the gallows was done. His body twisted slowly in the sea breeze. Crows already gathering in the periphery as the crowd dispersed, eager for the next grisly spectacle. Thus passed Edward Cobham, buccaneer, by way of the Marshal's dance, an end that awaited the luckless majority of those who embarked upon the sweet trade of piracy. For all the perils and hardships of their life, remarkably, a few extraordinary women also made their mark as pirates during the Golden Age, most famously Anne Bonny and Mary Red. Unlike the crushing majority of female contemporaries, forever shackled to domestic drudgery, their fates circumscribed by the men who owned them as wives and daughters, Bonny and Red seized the freedom of the outlaw and lived large upon the high seas. Though they hailed from wildly disparate backgrounds, Bonny, a high-born, wild-tempered Irish beauty, Red, a penniless English tomboy, the two women were kindred spirits, driven to piracy by rebellion against the soul-crushing futures that limited their sex. Bonny fled scandal and an arranged marriage to elope with the penniless sailor Jack Rackham. Red bound her breasts, took a male name, and sought her fortune as a soldier, then as a buccaneer. Together they forged a defiant sisterhood, fighting and carousing alongside the men, asking and giving no quarter in combat. For a few short years, Bonny and Red lived with a brash, dizzying freedom that was otherwise unthinkable for women in the 18th century. But their idyll proved tragically brief, undone, ironically, by the very womanhood whose shackles they had so boldly thrown off. Captured at last, after a ferocious battle off Jamaica, and unmasked as women, they found their sex afforded them no path to clemency. Rackham and the rest of the crew faced summary hanging, while Bonny and Reed were condemned to await trial and near certain execution in the fetid squalor of a Jamaican prison. Bonny and Reed never faced that final dance at Gallows Point. Both escaped the noose by pleading the belly, the legal reprieve afforded to pregnant women. Reed succumbed to jail fever, and her child was stillborn. She died in her cell mere days before her scheduled execution. Of Bonny's ultimate fate, nothing definitive is known. She simply disappeared from the record after the birth of her child. Some said she reconciled with her estranged father and lived to a ripe old age as a respectable matron. But it is just as likely that her restless spirit never found peace on land, and she perished alone in some distant corner of the New World, dreaming to the last of the sweet trade and her days of unbound freedom on the rolling sea. Those days were already fading into twilight as Bonny and Reed languished in Spanish Town prison. The golden age of piracy flickered and drew inexorably to its end in the first decades of the 18th century, snuffed out by an accelerating series of crackdowns on both sea and land. The British Crown and Royal Navy escalated their campaigns against buccaneers, driven by the need to protect expanding imperial trade routes. Pirate havens like Nassau and Port Royal fell one by one, scoured clean of freebooters by marine assault and land invasion. Pirate hunting became an industry in its own right, as the Admiralty contracted private men of war to seek out and destroy the brigand scourge. Pirate hunters like Woodes Rogers and Benjamin Hornigold, once pirates themselves, now turned mercenary in the service of the Crown. Rogers in particular was a tenacious and merciless pirate killer, pursuing his former brethren with a convert's zeal. In 1718, the king appointed him royal governor of the Bahamas, specifically to wipe out the pirate menace. Rogers took to the task with gusto, announcing a blanket pardon for all pirates who surrendered, but promising to exterminate with fire and sword all who refused. True to his word, he made the gun's smoke-choked waters around Nassau run red in a series of savage clashes with recalcitrant freebooters. The infamous Charles Vane held out longest, waging a guerrilla war of desperate evasion. But the writing was on the wall. Within a year, the pirate republic had fallen, replaced with a heavily fortified crown colony. A shrewd administrator, as well as a ruthless pirate killer, Rogers sought to remake the Bahamas into a law-abiding commercial hub. Leveraging the island's strategic location, He developed a thriving trade in salvaged cargo while building up the infrastructure of Nassau town. His carrot and stick approach worked. Pardoned pirates streamed in to accept clemency and the opportunity for a new, peaceful life as settlers. But diehards like Vane fought bitterly to the end and were duly hanged for their obstinacy. Once the flagship of the Golden Age, Nassau now stood as the gallows of its final resistance. The story played out over and again across the Caribbean. The noose tightened by the year around the pirate world as their former havens fell like dominoes. Port Royal, Tortuga, St. Thomas, St. Croix, even remote Madagascar. Wherever freebooters once found sanctuary to careen, conceal their plunder, and revel in liberty, increasingly they found royal garrisons and the steel jaws of the Admiralty's justice snapping at their heels. Ever-growing convoys of naval frigates and private pirate hunters relentlessly hounded the surviving buccaneers at sea. Ever-diminishing spaces offered them safety or succor on land. Even as their tactical options shrank, changing economic conditions snuffed out much of the incentive for piracy in the first place. A global trade depression hit the flow of rich commerce that was the lifeblood of buccaneering. Wages for regular seamen began to rise, while prize-taking became more uncertain and financial backers more skittish. Many surviving pirates calculated that the risks of the sweet trade were no longer worth the rapidly diminishing rewards. Slowly, inexorably, piracy began to flicker. We last left off with a description of the horrific conditions aboard filthy, overcrowded pirate ships, and the brutal code of conduct that governed the desperate men who crewed them. Infractions as minor as stealing a fellow pirate's share of food could be punished with marooning, a slow, agonizing death sentence alone on some desolate island. Such was the fate of two hapless souls aboard the pirate ship Revenge in 1718. Convicted by the crew of swiping extra rations, the two men were set ashore on an uninhabited spit of land off the Bahamas, with only a flask of gunpowder and a bottle of rum to speed their demise. One can only imagine the growing despair they felt watching the Revenge's sails vanish over the horizon, knowing that only miles of empty ocean now surrounded their sandy prison. Such harsh punishments paled in comparison to the ever-present spectres of disease and malnourishment that plagued pirate ships. Expeditions could drag on for months, with no sight of land or resupply, and the only food was often maggot-infested meat and stale, weevil-ridden biscuits. Without access to fresh fruit and vegetables, scurvy was a pirate's constant companion. The accounts of pirate surgeon John Cranky vividly capture the suffering this vitamin deficiency inflicted. In his journal, he describes a pirate named James Dougal, whose teeth loosened and gums grew so spongy and rotten that he could suck his mouth full of blood by merely closing his lips. As the disease progressed, Dougal was racked by joint pain, his skin erupted in foul-smelling sores, and he spit out bits of his own putrefying flesh. After 2 months of agony, he finally succumbed, one of countless pirates to fall victim to the nutritional ravages of life at sea. When they weren't slowly wasting away from disease or malnutrition, pirates faced the prospect of sudden and violent death in combat. While popular culture often portrays them as swashbuckling adventurers, real pirates relied far more on speed, surprise, and intimidation than swordplay and derring-do. A lone merchant ship, unlucky enough to sail into a pirate's sights, first realized its peril when the distant vessel suddenly unfurled additional sails and surged forward in pursuit. The last thing many captains saw was the terrifying skull and crossbones of the Jolly Roger whipping in the wind as the pirates pulled alongside, a psychological ploy to shock their prey into immediate surrender. Those merchant crews brave or foolish enough to resist were swiftly treated to a barrage of ear-splitting cannon fire as the pirates unleashed their opening salvos. Amid the splintering planks and screams of the wounded, the pirates swarmed aboard, ruthlessly cutting down any opposition with a frenzy of swinging cutlasses, stabbing daggers, and point-blank pistol shots. Such was the grim fate of the Dutch merchant vessel Duinenvoorde in 1717, when it had the misfortune to cross paths with the pirate Edward Teach, better known to history as Blackbeard. According to surviving accounts, Blackbeard's crew subjected the Duinenvoorde to a ferocious barrage, reducing its mainmast and many of its crew to bloody splinters. As the pirates boarded, the Dutch seamen frantically tried to barricade themselves below decks, only to have the hatches torn open and be picked off one by musket fire or forced back topside at sword point. Within minutes, the decks were slick with blood and the pirates were in total control. Blackbeard, a towering figure with a wild black beard braided with ribbons, strode through the carnage with a necklace of his victim's ears bouncing against his chest. He ordered the Duinenvoorde thoroughly plundered, even having his men hack gold inlay out of the ship's woodwork. Barrels of sugar and sacks of coffee were loaded aboard his ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge. The surviving crew were stripped of their clothing and possessions. With a mocking bow, Blackbeard departed the shattered ship, leaving its crew to limp back to port and spread terrified tales of the monstrous pirate. After risking scurvy, maiming, and violent death, one might imagine that pirates who survived a raid were handsomely rewarded. The promise of treasure was certainly alluring to desperate men, but the reality was often far less glamorous than the fables of buried chests groaning with gold doubloons and glittering jewels. Most of a pirate's plunder consisted of the everyday trade goods filling merchant ships: bolts of cloth, barrels of flour, sacks of tobacco, things that could be sold in port for a modest profit, but hardly made one rich overnight. Spanish treasure galleons made irresistible targets, but were relatively rare and zealously guarded by warships. What profit pirates did make was divided according to a fiercely egalitarian code. A share was even apportioned for the ship's fund to compensate crew who lost limbs in battle. The lion's portion went not to the captain but to the crew, with even the lowliest seamen guaranteed their cut. This was one reason for the brutal discipline aboard pirate ships, as each man jealously watched his fellows for any whiff of unfairness that might cheat him of his rightful due. When shares were handed out, pirates tended to quickly drink, gamble, and whore away their earnings in the nearest port in a riotous bacchanal of vice and excess. For most pirates, the promise of wealth was an elusive siren song that drove them to ever greater risks and depravity, yet remained always just out of reach. They chased a fantasy of riches and freedom, even as the grim realities of shipboard life slowly dragged them closer to a watery grave or the hangman's noose. Yet not all souls aboard pirate ships were desperate men driven to crime. A handful of women carved out a place in this brutal world, disguising themselves as men to seek out the promise of adventure and autonomy, denied their gender on land. Two rose to infamy and came to haunt the seas in the early 1700s. Their names were Anne Bonny and Mary Red. Both had grown up on the margins of society, finding their way into piracy by circuitous paths. Bonny was the headstrong, flame-haired daughter of an Irish lawyer. Disowned by her family for marrying a penniless sailor, she later abandoned her husband to take up with the charismatic pirate captain, John Calico Jack Rackham. Red had a stranger path still. Raised as a boy by her widowed mother to gain access to inheritance money, she lived most of her life with her true sex concealed. She found work as a sailor and later a soldier, fighting in European wars before jumping to the West Indies and piracy. According to pirate law, Bonny and Reed met by chance. Bonny, already serving aboard Rackham's ship, took a liking to the handsome young pirate who'd just joined the crew, only to discover he was a woman in disguise just like herself. The two became fast friends and perhaps more, Some tales whisper of a scandalous secret romance. What's undisputed is that Bonnie and Red quickly forged a fearsome reputation as two of the toughest, most ruthless pirates in Rackham's crew. During the heat of battle and the chaos of boarding, their male disguises slipped and their identities were revealed to all. Yet their ferocity and skill at arms only burnished their notoriety. In one famous incident, Rackham and most of the male crew fled below decks during a battle with a Jamaican patrol boat, leaving Bonnie and Red alone to fight on. As the male pirates cowered, the two women rained curses, insults, and even volleys of gunfire down the hatches, exhorting their crewmates to grow some spine and get back up to the battle. Their meteoric pirate careers came to an abrupt end when Rackham's ship was cornered by pirate hunters in 1720. The crew was too busy swilling rum to put up much resistance. Only Bonnie and Red fought like furies against the boarding party until finally subdued. All were hauled off to Jamaica to stand trial. Rackham and the other men were quickly convicted and hanged. Bonnie and Red escaped the noose by pleading their bellies, revealing they were both pregnant. The tactic merely delayed their date with the gallows, or so it seemed. But fate, as ever, had its own twists in store. Red succumbed to a fever mere days before her scheduled execution. Bonnie languished in prison longer, spitting curses at visitors and even her own doomed lover Rackham. "Had you fought like a man," she allegedly sneered at him, "you need not have hanged like a dog." Then the records fall silent and she simply vanishes from history, either perishing in squalor or somehow slipping the hangman's grasp to start life anew. Such were the larger-than-life careers of Bonnie and Red. Forged in a crucible of hardship, their brash exploits captivated the public of their time and ever since. They stood as symbols of women who refused to accept the downtrodden roles forced upon them by society, but instead carved their own path through a world of men with swagger, steel, and the occasional swig of rum. But whether man or woman, a pirate's life was usually as short and brutal as it was daring. Here's the next part of the script. The end of Thomas Anstis and his crew in the Caribbean was emblematic of the grim and often short lives of pirates in the Golden Age. In reality, the pirate life was nasty, brutish, and short. The average career of a pirate lasted little more than a year before meeting a violent end. Even the famous pirates whose names still echo through the centuries rarely survived more than 2 or 3 years of freebooting. Contrary to the romanticized Hollywood image of swashbuckling adventurers, most pirates lived on the razor's edge between feast and famine. A crew might pull off a rich score and live large in a friendly pirate port for a short spell, but their plunder would soon be frittered away on wine, women, gambling, and paying off debts. Before long, they'd be driven back out to sea, desperate for the next prize. Pirates were motivated less by get-rich dreams than the desire to escape the back-breaking drudgery of legitimate sailors' work. But their shipboard life was often just as full of ceaseless toil. Mending sails and rigging, pumping bilges, hauling at the capstan. And it carried the constant risk of battle wounds, amputations, tropical diseases with no medical care. A pirate ship's articles guaranteed each man an equal share of any spoils. But it was very much easy come, easy go. Only a few famed pirate captains ever accumulated any lasting wealth. The hardships of the pirate life can be vividly seen in the case of Edward Lowe, one of the most notorious pirates of the Golden Age. Born in London around 1690, Lowe started out as a pickpocket and thief. In his early 20s, he was transported to the Americas as an indentured servant, a common fate for the poor. After completing his term of servitude in 1718, Lowe signed on with a sloop headed to Honduras to cut logwood, a valuable dyewood. But his vicious temper quickly got him into trouble. In a drunken argument, Lowe killed a fellow crewman with an axe blow and fled into the jungle. There he joined a hardened gang of escaped slaves, convicts, and deserters. They robbed merchants and farmers around the Bay of Honduras, with Lowe rising to command through his sheer ferocity. Lowe's piratical career began in earnest when his gang seized a small ship and he was elected captain. He captured a larger brigantine and then set his sights on the lucrative shipping lanes of the Caribbean. Lowe cut a notorious figure, with his bushy black beard and the smoking matches he kept wedged behind each ear, ready to light the fuse of a cannon in battle. He and his crew terrorized the Caribbean for 2 years, taking over 100 ships flying English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese colors. Lowe had a reputation as the most bloodthirsty pirate of his day. He was infamous for torturing prisoners, cutting off ears and noses, even roasting victims alive on his deck to make them reveal where valuables were hidden. In May 1722, Lowe's flotilla captured a large Portuguese treasure ship near Madeira. It was carrying gold dust and bars, jewels, and 1,200 chests of sugar, a huge haul. Lowe's men forced the passengers and crew onto the deck, stripped them naked, and then hacked them to pieces one by one and threw the bodies overboard, howling with glee. But just a year after this massacre, Lowe's luck ran out. While cruising near the Azores, his ship was overtaken by a British man-of-war, the HMS Greyhound. After a bloody battle, Lowe escaped capture by leaping into a small boat and fleeing with a few men, but he had nowhere to run. In the end, he was left adrift in a tiny pinnace, without adequate food or water. Lowe was never seen again. Some say he died a lingering death, starving alone and raving mad on the open sea. A fitting end, perhaps, for such a vicious killer, but also a reminder of the delusions of grandeur that led so many desperate men to the pirate life in the brutal era of the Golden Age. The promise of freedom and riches all too often delivered only a world of suffering and a lonely, anonymous demise. As the Golden Age waned in the 1720s, the colonial officials were eager to make an example of any pirate crews they managed to capture. The British Navy had clamped down and was aggressively hunting pirates throughout the Caribbean. Trials of pirates became media sensations in London, with crowds flocking to see the notorious villains in the dock. Daring tales of their crimes were rushed into print in popular pamphlets and newspapers. The pirate captain Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, was a prime target for the pirate hunters. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the pirate ship came alive with activity. The crew scrambled to light lanterns and torches, casting an eerie glow over the weathered deck. In the flickering light, the captain emerged from his cabin, his long coat billowing in the evening breeze. He surveyed his men with a steely gaze, taking note of their haggard appearance and weary expressions. Life aboard a pirate ship was not for the faint of heart. The conditions were cramped, filthy, and often violent. The average crew member had little more than a few square feet of personal space, usually just a hammock strung between the gun decks. Privacy was a luxury that few could afford, and the constant proximity to so many unwashed bodies made for a pungent and unpleasant atmosphere. The ship itself was a floating petri dish of disease and infection. Without proper sanitation or medical care, illnesses spread like wildfire through the close quarters. Scurvy was a particularly feared affliction, caused by a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables in the pirates' diet. As the disease progressed, the gums would swell and bleed, teeth would loosen and fall out, and old wounds would reopen. The sufferer would be racked with fever, joint pain and fatigue until finally succumbing to a slow and agonizing death. One such victim was a young pirate named Jack, barely out of his teens. He had joined the crew in search of adventure and riches, but after months at sea with nothing but salted meat and hardtack to eat, the first signs of scurvy began to appear. At first, he tried to hide his symptoms, fearing that he would be seen as weak and unfit for duty. But as the disease ravaged his body, it became impossible to conceal. The ship's surgeon, such as he was, could do little to help. His medical knowledge was rudimentary at best, and his tools were often rusty and unsterilized. He prescribed a poultice of urine and gunpowder to be applied to Jack's bleeding gums, but it only served to increase his agony. As the young pirate's condition worsened, he became a pariah among the crew, shunned and avoided like a leper. In desperation, Jack sought out the captain, hoping for a reprieve from his duties so that he might rest and recover. But the captain was not a man given to mercy. He saw illness as a sign of weakness, and weakness had no place on his ship. With a sneer of contempt, he ordered Jack to return to his post, despite his obvious suffering. For days, Jack struggled to keep up with the demands of shipboard life, his body racked with pain and his mind clouded by fever. He stumbled through his duties, leaving smears of blood on the ropes and railings as he went. At night, he would collapse into his hammock, too exhausted even to remove his boots. Finally, during a particularly stormy watch, Jack's strength gave out. He collapsed on the deck, his body convulsing in agony. The crew stepped over and around him, too busy with their own tasks to spare him a second glance. It was there, sprawled on the wet and splintered wood, that Jack took his final breath. Just another casualty of the pirate life. His body was unceremoniously tossed overboard, disappearing into the churning waves without so much as a prayer. Such was the fate of many who embarked on a life of piracy. If disease didn't claim them, then battle or execution surely would. Combat was a brutal and bloody affair, with no quarter given or expected. Pirates were known for their ferocity in battle, wielding cutlasses and flintlock pistols with deadly skill. But even the most seasoned fighter could fall victim to a well-placed musket ball or cannon blast. Those who survived the fight often wished they hadn't. Wounds quickly became infected in the unsanitary conditions aboard ship, and amputation was the most common treatment for serious injuries. The ship's surgeon would hack off the damaged limb with a saw, cauterizing the stump with boiling tar to prevent bleeding. If the patient was lucky, he would merely pass out from the pain. If not, his screams would echo through the ship for hours on end. Even if a pirate managed to avoid death by illness or injury, he still faced the constant threat of capture and execution. The British Navy and other maritime powers had no mercy for those who engaged in piracy, seeing them as the lowest form of criminal scum. Captured pirates were often subjected to brutal interrogations and torture before being publicly hanged as an example to others. One of the most famous victims of this fate was the notorious pirate captain Charles Vane. A man of fearsome reputation, Vane had terrorized the Caribbean for years, amassing a fortune in plundered gold and jewels. But his luck finally ran out when he was captured by a British naval vessel in 1720. Vane was taken back to Jamaica in chains, where he was put on trial for his crimes. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was quickly found guilty. On the day of his execution, Vane was paraded through the streets of Port Royal, his hands bound behind his back and a noose around his neck. A jeering crowd pelted him with rotten fruit and dead cats as he stumbled towards the gallows. At the scaffold, Vane was given a chance to speak his last words. But instead of expressing remorse or begging for mercy, he used his final moments to curse his captors and vow revenge from beyond the grave. As the executioner tightened the noose around his neck, Vane let loose with a string of profanities so vile that several women in the crowd fainted dead away. And then, with a sickening crack, it was over. Charles Vane, the scourge of the Caribbean, was dead. His body was left to rot in the sun as a warning to other would-be pirates, a grim reminder of the fate that awaited them if they chose a life of crime on the high seas. But even in death, the legend of Charles Vane lived on. Tales of his exploits spread far and wide, becoming more embellished and fantastical with each retelling. In the years that followed, he would be transformed from a vicious criminal into a romantic anti-hero, a symbol of rebellion against the oppressive forces of the British Empire. It was a fate that would befall many pirates in the centuries to come. As the golden age of piracy faded into history, the brutal realities of the pirate life were gradually forgotten, replaced by a mythology of adventure, romance, and buried treasure. In books, plays, and eventually films, pirates became dashing rogues and lovable scoundrels, their crimes and cruelties glossed over in favor of a more palatable narrative. But the truth of the pirate life was far darker and more complex than any storybook could capture. For every swashbuckling hero like Captain Jack Sparrow, there were dozens of men like poor Jack the scurvy-ridden deckhand, whose suffering and sacrifice have been lost to history. And for every glamorous tale of buried treasure and daring escapes, there were countless stories of brutality, disease, and despair. Perhaps that is why we continue to be fascinated by pirates, even as we recoil from the grim realities of their existence. They represent a kind of freedom and rebellion that we can only imagine, a life lived on the edge of society and the law. But they also remind us of the darker aspects of human nature, the cruelty and greed that lurk beneath the surface of even the most civilized among us. As the last light fades from the sky and the pirate ship sails on into the night, we are left to ponder these contradictions, the romance and the reality, the heroism and the horror, the freedom and the fate that awaited all who flew the black flag. And in the end, perhaps we are not so different from those long-dead pirates, searching for meaning and adventure in a world that is often harsh and unforgiving. So let us raise a glass to the pirates of old, those brave and terrible men who lived and died by the sword and the sea. May their stories continue to captivate and horrify us, even as we rest our heads and drift off into a more peaceful slumber. For in the end, that is the true legacy of the pirate life. Not gold or glory, but the enduring power of a tale well told, echoing through the ages like the ghost of Charles Vane, cursing and laughing in the wind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Caribbean sky in vivid streaks of orange and red, the pirate ship came alive with activity. Lanterns were lit, casting a flickering glow across the weathered deck planks. The crew gathered around, some perched on barrels or coils of rope, others leaning against the gunwales. They spoke in low, gruff voices, swapping tales of past raids and narrow escapes. Among them sat a grizzled old pirate, his face etched with scars and his remaining eye gleaming in the lantern light. The younger crew members looked to him with a mix of reverence and fear, for he was a living legend, a man who had seen and done more in his decades on the high seas than most could imagine. As the night wore on and the rum flowed freely, the old pirate began to spin a yarn. His voice was low and rough, like the scrape of barnacles on a ship's hull. The crew leaned in closer, hanging on his every word. "You think you know what it means to be a pirate," he rasped, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces. "You think it's all about the gold and the glory, the freedom of the open sea. But let me tell you, lads, there's a price to be paid for this life. A steep price, and not just in coin." He took a long swig from his tankard, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I've seen things that would turn your hair white. Men drowning in their own blood, crying for their mothers as they slipped beneath the waves. Scurvy-ridden wretches, their gums bleeding and their teeth falling out, and the stench of a ship after months at sea, with no fresh water to wash away the filth and the rot." The old pirate shook his head, his eye distant with memory. "Aye, there's a reason they call it the devil's own trade. You might think you're free out here, but the sea's a harsh mistress. She'll take everything you have, and then she'll take some more." He leaned back, the lamplight playing across the deep lines of his face. "Take me own sorry tale. I was a young lad, not much older than some of you, when I first set foot on a pirate deck. Thought I'd left all my troubles behind on land. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. The old pirate's gaze turned inward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Me first captain was a right bastard, a cruel man with a temper like a hurricane. He'd flog ye for looking at him sideways, and heaven help ye if ye crossed him. I saw him keel-haul a man once, just for snitching an extra ration of rum. Poor sod was half drowned and bleeding from 100 cuts by the time they hauled him up. Didn't even last the night. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. And that was just the start of it. We'd go weeks, sometimes months without setting foot on dry land, living on nothing but mouldy biscuits and rancid water. The scurvy would set in, making our joints ache and our teeth fall out. And the rats. Dear God, the rats. You couldn't sleep for fear of them biting your fingers and toes. The crew shifted uneasily, some casting nervous glances at the dark corners of the deck. The old pirate paid them no mind, lost in his grim recollections. We'd raid any ship we came across, no matter how small the prize. Had to, just to keep ourselves fed and watered. The fighting was fierce and bloody, cutlasses clashing and pistols flashing in the smoke. I saw men gutted like fish, their entrails spilling out on the deck. Saw heads cleaved clean in two, brains splattering. He trailed off, his eye haunted. For a long moment, the only sound was the creaking of the ship's timbers and the gentle lap of waves against the hull. Aye, I've seen the devil's own work out here, the old pirate said at last. And I've done my share of it too. You don't survive long in this life without getting your hands dirty, without losing a piece of your soul. He looked up, his gaze fixing on the youngest member of the crew, a mere boy with wide, frightened eyes. You still want to be a pirate, lad, after hearing all that? The boy swallowed hard, his face pale in the lantern light. But he nodded, his jaw set with grim determination. The old pirate sighed, shaking his head. Then you'd best pray you never live long enough to regret it, he said softly. For the sea's a cruel mistress, and piracy's a crueler trade. You'll pay for your freedom, lad. One way or another, you'll pay. With that, he pushed himself to his feet, his joints creaking like old timbers. The crew parted before him as he stumped across the deck, disappearing into the shadows of the aft cabin. For a long while after he had gone, no one spoke. They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, their own dark imaginings of what the future might hold. For to be a pirate in the golden age was to court death and damnation with every breath. It was to live on the knife's edge between freedom and oblivion, never knowing which way the blade might fall. And yet, for some, that very danger was a siren's call, a temptation too powerful to resist. For in a world of grinding poverty and brutal oppression, the lure of the pirate life shone like a beacon, promising riches and glory beyond imagining. But as the old pirate had warned, that promise came with a price. A price measured in blood and suffering, in shattered lives and lost souls. For to be a pirate was to be forever an outcast, hunted and reviled by the very society that had spawned you. It was to live in constant fear of the noose and the gibbet, of the slow, agonizing death that awaited all who dared to fly the black flag. And yet, for a brief, shining moment in history, the pirates of the Golden Age had blazed like comets across the Caribbean sky. They had lived as kings and died as legends, their names and deeds immortalized in song and story. But behind the myth and the romance lay a darker truth, a reality steeped in blood and brutality. For the true story of the Golden Age of piracy was one of desperate men and harrowing choices, of lives cut short, and dreams dashed upon the rocks of an uncaring sea. It was a story that began, more often than not, in the festering hellholes of the Atlantic slave trade. For many of the men who would go on to become the most notorious pirates of their age had begun their lives in bondage, shackled in the holds of the very ships they would one day plunder. They were the unwanted and the outcasts, the dregs of society swept up by the tides of history and cast adrift on an unforgiving ocean. Some were runaway slaves, others indentured servants who had fled their master's cruelty. Still others were former sailors, men who had served in the navies of Europe's warring empires, only to find themselves discarded like so much refuse when the fighting was done. For these men, piracy offered a chance at a new life, a way to strike back at a world that had shown them nothing but cruelty and contempt. They banded together in small crews, pooling their meager resources to buy or steal a ship and set out in search of plunder. At first, their targets were small, fishing boats and coastal traders, easy prey for their shallow-drafted sloops and schooners. But as their numbers grew and their reputation spread, they began to set their sights on bigger prizes. Merchant ships laden with gold and silver from the Spanish Main, lumbering East Indiamen packed with spices and silks from the Far East. These were the prizes that drew the pirates like moths to a flame, promising riches beyond their wildest dreams. But the reality of life aboard a pirate ship was far from the romanticized image of adventure and camaraderie. Conditions were brutal, with cramped quarters, meager rations, and constant exposure to the elements. Disease was rampant, with outbreaks of dysentery, yellow fever, and malaria claiming countless lives. And then there was the ever-present threat of violence, both from within the crew and without. Pirates lived by a strict code, with harsh punishments meted out for even minor infractions. Thieves and mutineers faced marooning on a desert island, while those who dared to question the captain's authority could expect a flogging, or worse. But even these harsh measures could not always keep the peace aboard a pirate ship. With tempers frayed by long months at sea and the constant threat of capture or death, it was not uncommon for arguments to erupt into bloody brawls, with crewmates turning on each other in fits of rage and frustration. And always, there was the spectre of the hangman's noose, the fate that awaited all pirates if they were ever captured by the authorities. For while the great empires of Europe might turn a blind eye to the depredations of the pirates when it suited their interests, they would not hesitate to hunt them down and make an example of them if they ever became too much of a nuisance. It was a precarious existence, balanced on a razor's edge between the promise of untold riches and the certainty of a grisly death. And yet, for a time, the pirates of the Golden Age had made it work, carving out a bloody niche for themselves in the margins of an uncaring world. Among the most notorious of these freebooters was Edward Teach, better known to history as Blackbeard. A towering figure with a wild, unkempt beard and a fearsome reputation, Teach had begun his piratical career as a privateer in Queen Anne's War, preying on French and Spanish shipping in the Caribbean. But when the war ended and the demand for privateers dried up, Teach had turned to outright piracy, assembling a crew of hardened cutthroats and setting out to make his fortune on the high seas. He quickly made a name for himself as one of the most feared pirates in the Caribbean. His very appearance, with his long, braided beard, and his habit of lighting fuses in his hair before battle, enough to strike terror into the hearts of his victims. But for all his fearsome reputation, Teach was also known as a cunning and charismatic leader, one who inspired fierce loyalty in his crew. He was said to be a fair and generous captain, dividing the spoils of his raids equally among his men, and never hesitating to put his own life on the line in battle. It was this combination of ruthlessness and charisma that made Blackbeard such a formidable foe, one who would plague the shipping lanes of the Caribbean for years, before finally meeting his end at the hands of a Royal Navy expedition in 1718. But even in death, the legend of Blackbeard lived on, his name and deeds immortalized in the annals of pirate lore. For in an age when life was cheap and death came swiftly, the pirates of the Golden Age had seized their moment in the sun, living fast and dying young in a blaze of glory. And yet, for all their bravado and daring, The reality of life as a pirate was far from the romantic ideal. It was a brutal, unforgiving existence, one in which every day was a struggle for survival against the elements, against disease and starvation, and against the constant threat of capture and execution. Many pirates, perhaps even the majority, met their end not in glorious battle or with chests of plundered gold, but in squalor and misery, their bodies racked by scurvy or dysentery, their minds shattered by the constant strain of life on the edge, and even for those who survived to enjoy their ill-gotten gains, the rewards of piracy were fleeting at best. With no safe haven to call their own and no way to protect their wealth, many pirates found themselves quickly parted from their treasure, either through their own profligacy or at the hands of their fellow buccaneers. In the end, the golden age of piracy was a brief and bloody chapter in the history of the Caribbean, a time when desperate men and women had seized their destiny in their own hands and set out to make their fortunes on the high seas. But for all its tales of adventure and daring, the true legacy of the golden age was one of suffering and brutality, of lives cut short and dreams dashed upon the rocks of an uncaring world. And as the old pirate had warned the young crew member, it was a life that exacted a heavy price from all those who chose to embrace it. A price paid in blood and anguish, in broken bodies and shattered minds. For in the end, the freedom and fortune promised by the pirate life proved as elusive and ephemeral as the mists that shrouded the Caribbean dawn, and those who chased that dream would find themselves forever haunted by its spectre, their lives and their fates inextricably bound to the cruel mistress that was the sea. As the night wore on and the crew drifted off to their hammocks one by one, the old pirate remained on deck, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, for he knew all too well the price that he had paid for his life of piracy, the toll that it had taken on his body and his soul. And yet, even in his darkest moments, he could not bring himself to regret the choices that he had made. For in a world that had offered him nothing but hardship and pain, the pirate life had given him a fleeting taste of freedom, a chance to live life on his own terms, if only for a little while. And so he stood there, watching the stars wheel overhead, his mind adrift in a sea of memories, of battles fought and comrades lost, of treasures won and fortunes squandered, of a life lived on the razor's edge, forever balanced between hope and despair. And as the first light of dawn began to paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the old pirate smiled to himself, his weathered face creasing with the weight of years. For he knew that whatever fate awaited him, he had lived his life to the fullest, had seized his destiny with both hands and made it his own. And in the end, perhaps that was all that any man could ask for, to have lived, and to have left his mark upon the world, however brief and bloody it might have been. As the Battle of New Providence faded into history, the new Royal Governor Woodes Rogers set about the hard work of stamping out the pirate scourge in the Bahamas. After his exploits as a privateer and sea captain, Rogers had been handpicked by King George I to restore law and order to the islands. He started by offering the king's pardon to any pirates who would agree to renounce their wicked ways and return to an honest life. Hundreds of buccaneers wisely took the deal, handing over their plundered treasures in return for clemency. One of the first to accept was none other than Benjamin Hornigold, Rogers' old sailing companion who had trained the notorious Blackbeard and Sam Bellamy in the dark arts of piracy. Now reformed, Hornigold zealously joined Rogers' mission to rid the West Indies of his former brethren. With intimate knowledge of the pirates' tactics and hideouts, he became an invaluable pirate hunter. Together, Rogers and Hornigold embarked on a tireless crusade to track down and bring to justice the worst brigands of the high seas. One of their first targets was the infamous Charles Vane. Once a lowly sailor on Hornigold's old sloop, Vane had mutinied after Hornigold accepted the king's pardon and declared himself captain over the rogue crew. A cruel and merciless buccaneer, Vane cut a vicious swath across the Caribbean, plundering and burning any ship he could take. With a small flotilla at his command, Rogers set out in hot pursuit of Vane's ship, the Ranger. After a harrowing chase through the Windward Passage, the pirate hunter's flagship Delicia unleashed a thunderous broadside, crippling the Ranger's mainmast. But before Rogers could board her, a howling hurricane suddenly descended, nearly dashing both vessels against the rocky coast of Cuba. Through valiant seamanship, both captains managed to ride out the storm, but when the skies cleared, the Ranger had vanished. Vane had escaped yet again to maraud another day. An exasperated Rogers would continue to chase the wily pirate for months to come. Such was the monumental challenge the pirate hunters faced as they tried to scour clean the pirate-infested waters of the West Indies in the waning years of the golden age of piracy. For every buccaneer brought to the gallows, it seemed two more would hoist the black flag and set out to pillage with impunity. Meanwhile, the pirates themselves were finding their blood-soaked trade increasingly difficult and unprofitable. The Royal Navy's presence seemed to double by the month as more and more warships prowled the Caribbean, hunting for pirate vessels. Legitimate merchant ships now bristled with cannons and armed guards, making them far harder prizes to take. The brutal tactics required to overcome these measures often meant little plunder left to show for the pirates' efforts afterwards. The risks to life and limb scarcely seemed worth the dwindling rewards. More and more freebooters began to accept the king's pardon and find gainful employment in the expanding maritime trades made possible by colonialism. Those die-hard brigands who persisted in their wicked ways faced ever grimmer odds and outcomes. The infamous Edward Blackbeard Teach met his gory end at the hands of the pirate-hunting Lieutenant Robert Maynard in a ferocious ship-to-ship battle off the North Carolina coast. Maynard's men are said to have hacked Blackbeard's carcass into over 20 pieces before triumphantly mounting his severed head on the bowsprit of their sloop. Charles Vane's luck finally ran out when his crew mutinied and cast him adrift in a small boat. Wrecked on an uninhabited island, the dreaded pirate barely survived for months as a castaway before being captured by a passing British ship. He was hauled back to Port Royal in chains to stand trial for his atrocities. Unrepentant to the end, Vane raged and cursed as he was sentenced to hang in the public square, promising hellfire and damnation on the whole island. But his defiant invectives suddenly turned to ashen, trembling fear as he ascended the gallows and saw with bulging eyes the noose being fitted around his neck. The man who had terrorized the high seas for years reportedly collapsed into incoherent tears and pleas for mercy, even as the crowd roared for his blood. In a final indignity, the hangman's rope snapped on the first attempt, prolonging Vane's agonized demise as he twitched and wheezed through a horrifically botched second hanging. Such was the fate of most pirates in the end, an ignominious, abject death, either in battle by public execution or claimed by any of the myriad scourges of the seafaring life. A fortunate few managed to cheat the hangman and hell by retiring with their plunder. But they were rare exceptions to the wretched rule. By 1726, the golden age of piracy in the Caribbean had largely gutted out, suppressed by the might of the British Empire, and rendered unsustainable by the changing tides of maritime commerce. The seas that had once swarmed with the black flags of freebooters were increasingly safe for all but the odd rogue corsair. The legendary Republic of Pirates on New Providence lay in crumbling ruins, abandoned by its denizens for the noose or honest sailing work. Here and there, wanted posters offering handsome bounties for notorious holdouts fluttered on tavern walls and town squares, promising rough justice for those who still dared to plunder under the skull and crossbones. But already, even before the age of piracy had truly breathed its last, the romanticization and mythologizing had begun. Sensationalized accounts like Captain Charles Johnson's a general history of the robberies and murders of the most notorious pirates, filled London bookstores, their pages brimming with swashbuckling, larger-than-life distortions of the pirates' exploits that captivated the public. Over the ensuing centuries, the improbable legend of the noble pirate would only grow in the popular imagination, culminating in our familiar modern depictions of jaunty, adventurous rogues. Ubiquitous Halloween costumes of eye patches, peg legs, and stuffed parrots on shoulders. Disneyland rides where animatronic buccaneers belt out jaunty sea shanties as they pillage. The fanciful Hollywood epics of Errol Flynn and Johnny Depp swinging on chandeliers and quipping wittily as they cross swords with dastardly, bumbling adversaries. Against such a romanticized mythology, it can be hard to imagine the filthy, scarred, desperate men who actually sailed and died under the black flag 3 centuries ago, chasing an improbable dream of freedom and fortune, and finding mostly hardship, violence, and gruesome death instead. If the real Henry Avery or Charles Vane were alive today, they would likely find our glossy pop culture image of piracy bemusing at best and infuriating at worst. But such is the alchemy of history and human nature, to sand away the rough, jagged ugliness of the past and polish it into something palatable, even noble and aspirational. We prefer our pirates to be dashing, misunderstood anti-heroes, not the starving, abused and abusive fiends most of them actually were. Perhaps it is just too painful to stare directly into the abyss of human cruelty and desperation that piracy actually represented. And so, the salty old sea dogs of the golden age of piracy will go on living their second, more glorious lives as the stuff of legend, with all their misdeeds and miseries expunged, their tattered garments and rotting teeth transformed into velvet waistcoats and gold caps. Boys will play act at searching for buried treasure and walking the plank, while the restless ghosts of the real buccaneers howl and gibber, forever consigned to Davy Jones' locker. Such is the pirate's legacy, a twisted funhouse mirror image that has long eclipsed the truth. As you drift off tonight, spare a thought for the real pirates of the Caribbean, and be glad you'll wake up tomorrow to a world where the skull and crossbones is just a spooky bedtime story, not a portent of the capricious brutality of life at the mercy of the seas and selfish whims of men. As dusk fell on the Spanish port of Havana, a battered ship limped into the harbour. Her sails were tattered, her hull splintered by cannon shot. At her helm stood a grizzled man with a wild beard and a harder stare. Captain Charles Vane had come to the end of his rope. Vane was once a rising star among the pirates of New Providence. Daring and ruthless, he had plundered scores of ships and amassed a fortune in gold. But his very success had made him a marked man. The British Crown had placed a huge bounty on his head, dead or alive. His former ally, the pirate hunter Benjamin Hornigold, now pursued him relentlessly across the Caribbean. In his final months, Vane's luck had turned. His crew, their faith shaken by too many close scrapes, had threatened mutiny. With the net closing in, Vane hatched a desperate plan. He would beach his beloved ship, the Ranger, and escape inland with his treasure. From there, he hoped to bribe a merchant captain to smuggle him back to England, where he could start a new life. But it was not to be. As Vane and his men rowed ashore by moonlight, a shot rang out from the tree line. Then another. Hornigold's men had lain in wait, tipped off by a traitorous member of Vane's crew. Musket balls struck the longboat, splintering wood and flesh. Vane dove overboard, leaving his treasure and his dying crewmen behind. For 2 grueling days and nights, an injured Vane struggled through the steamy jungle, evading search parties and fighting off the agonizing pain of his wounds. But in the end, exhaustion and blood loss took their toll. Collapsing by a creek bed within sight of Havana's walls, his strength finally failed him. In his fevered dreams, Vane saw again the faces of the men he had left behind, the loyal ones he had failed, the traitors he longed to punish. But when he awoke, it was to the cocking of a pistol in his face. A detachment of British soldiers, alerted by the Spanish authorities, had found his hiding place. Vane was shackled and brought back to Port Royal in chains to stand trial. The verdict, a foregone conclusion, came swiftly: guilty of piracy on the high seas, to be hanged by the neck until dead. In his final days, Vane penned a letter to the world, unrepentant to the last. I must say I have, in my day, passed through many perils and hardships on the account of King George, and was badly rewarded in the end. Therefore, I owe England or King George no allegiance whatsoever. I promise to pay the reward to any man who takes me, except to an Englishman or the English nation. On a grey morning in March 1721, Charles Vane mounted the scaffold before a jeering crowd, the noose placed around his neck. Asked for his final words, he fixed his executioner with a defiant glare. "Damnation seize my soul if I give you quarters or take any from you." And with that, the trapdoor dropped and Vane plummeted to his death, kicking and choking as the rope snapped taut. Vane's body hung for days in Port Royal harbour, a gruesome warning to any who would follow the sweet trade. But in death, as in life, Vane refused to follow the script. According to local legend, his restless ghost lingered, haunting the sites of his greatest defeats. For the pirate captains who outlived Vane, his grim end was a stark reminder of the price of their brutal way of life. One by one, the infamous outlaws of the Golden Age would meet similar fates, dancing the hempen jig at Execution Dock, or falling in bloody last stands against superior forces. Blackbeard, shot down off North Carolina, his headless corpse thrown unceremoniously overboard. Bartholomew Roberts, the dread Black Bart, felled by grape shot off Africa as his crew abandoned him. Charles Bellamy and Sam Bellamy, wealthy pirate lords, drowned in shipwrecks along with their plundered gold. By the late 1720s, the glory days of the pirates were fading into memory. The European nations, their coffers drained by pirate depredations, at last united in their resolve to stamp out the scourge. Under pressure from the Royal Navy's pirate hunters and its growing fleet of nimble sloops, the great pirate bands unravelled. Their camps in Madagascar and New Providence were sacked, their secret harbours exposed. Scores were captured and executed, their sun-bleached skulls impaled on spikes as a public warning. Even those few pirate captains who survived the crackdowns and cutlasses soon found their way of life untenable. By the 1730s, the old wooden merchant ships, ponderous and vulnerable, were giving way to sleeker, faster, and better armed vessels. At the same time, a peacetime lull had glutted the maritime labour market, making recruits harder to find and less eager to risk the noose. A world that had once grudgingly tolerated the sea dogs as a necessary evil now closed ranks against them. Governors who had once turned a blind eye now followed a zero-tolerance policy, swiftly arresting any brigand who dared show his face in port. Wealthy merchants, their patience exhausted, hired private security in the form of armed merchantmen, a scourge nearly as fierce as the pirates themselves. And so, by degrees, the golden age of piracy guttered and went out like a spent candle. A few stubborn holdouts, like the notorious Edward Lowe, would continue to prowl the waves into the 1740s. But theirs were an increasingly desperate, tenuous existence, always one betrayal or mischance away from the yardarm. As the age of sail gave way to the age of steam, as the world's great empires carved up the map, the freewheeling world of the pirates passed into legend. In the popular imagination, the swashbuckling rogues of the Caribbean would take on a romantic sheen, their exploits celebrated in books and songs and tall tales. But the hard men who had actually lived the pirates' brutal life knew better. For them, piracy had been a revolt born of desperation, a a life of squalor and violence and ever-present death, with precious little of the storybook glamour. When pirate captain Sam Bellamy told a captive that he and his men were Robin Hood's men, serving a crude form of social justice, his hostage scoffed openly. What would these scarred and haunted men, their backs flayed by the lash, their minds and bodies wrecked by hardship, make of their legend? Of the children's tales that made heroes of their kind, the theme park rides celebrating their blood-soaked freedom, the fairer sex that once shunned them as the blackest villains now swooned for the merest hint of eyeliner and a tricorn hat. Irony of ironies for these forsaken pariahs. In death, the pirates had finally stolen the rarest prize of all, immortality. But you needn't take it from me. As you drift off tonight, simply imagine asking Blackbeard or Vane yourself. Picture sidling up to Anne Bonny in some raucous, flea-bitten dockside tavern, pressing a mug of grog into her mangled hand. A pirate's life for me, eh? You wink roguishly. Yo-ho-ho, and really bad eggs. But then you catch the look in Anne's kohl-rimmed eyes, at once pitying and contemptuous. A look that says, plainer than any words, "You don't know the half of it, landlubber. You don't know the half." And with that, we must let Anne and her kind return to their well-earned rest. While there is still a certain devilish allure to the pirate mythos, the reality was a waking nightmare for those who lived it. So the next time you see a pirate flag fluttering jauntily in the breeze, pause and spare a thought for Vane, Bellamy, Bonny, Reed, and all the doomed souls who sailed beneath it. If you enjoyed our journey through this hidden history, give a like and subscribe to let me know. Until next time, this is your boring historian, wishing you fair winds, following seas, and a clean escape from the King's justice. Good night.